My name is Dennis Gill with the Americans in Wartime Experience. Today's date is 5 March 2022, and I've got the pleasure of conducting an interview with Joseph Buche. I said that right, hopefully.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
Okay. Joe, if you could just give us a little bit of background. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in the early 60s in Arkansas.
Okay.
Spent the first, gosh, I don't know, 13 years, 12 years there, and then moved to Wisconsin for high school and college. So a little bit of a culture shock there,
Yeah.
but I can claim either heritage depending on the audience that I'm with. Went to school at the University of Wisconsin. Interestingly enough, I joined the Army because I was looking for somebody to pay for college. And the only people that offered were the Air Force and Navy and the Army. The Navy wanted a pure science major, the Air Force wanted a pure or applied science major, and the Army would accept any major except theology. So the Army it was. I was going to do 4 years and then be a politician, but fairly soon after I started doing it, I decided I loved it, so just stuck with it for a long time.
Yeah. Any other family members that were veterans?
So my father was a Navy vet. He got to be a Lieutenant JG in the Navy, and while he was serving on a destroyer, he liked it a lot. But he decided that's not what he wanted to do. So he joined the reserves and then left the Navy. Eventually went on to be an electrical engineering professor. My stepfather joined the Army again as a way to have somebody pay for college. He was in Korea between World War II and the Korean War, and as best I can tell, he did not care for any second he was in the Army. So it was interesting talking to him as I made the Army a career about it. My uncle was enlisted in the Kansas National Guard, and so we'd share some stories about that. But not a whole lot of Army veterans on my side of the family.
What war or conflict did you participate in?
I don't think it was a conflict. I'm not sure if it was war, but I started off in the Cold War, which I thought was an interesting experience. I was a lieutenant in Germany in the mid-'80s, and learned, like any lieutenant, learned a lot there. I was fortunate enough then to go to the 101st Airborne Division, and I was a company commander in 1st Battalion, 187th Infantry in Desert Storm. And then later on, I was fortunate enough to go back to the same regiment, the 187th, and I commanded 3rd Battalion of the 187th in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And then I was a senior officer. I was a Corps level Chief of Staff in Operation Enduring Freedom, and in that war surge, if you will, in 2010.
What year did you enlist, or what year were you your mission? I'm sorry.
So I was lucky enough. I actually enlisted in September of 1980, a few days before they changed the retirement system. Okay. So I got the highest pay is what they determined my retirement from. But I was commissioned in 1984.
Okay. And did you have a sense of what you wanted to do in the Army?
So when I started off, again, I really was actually I joined Army ROTC to pay for college. My first year, my instructor was a signal officer, a great guy named Captain Dave Goss. And I thought, yeah, I'll be a signal officer. The next year, my instructor was an engineer, and I thought that was pretty cool, so I thought, no, I'll be an engineer. My third year, my instructor was Captain Phil Mugford, a guy who I still stay in touch with today. And he was an infantryman. And I thought, this is the kind of guy I want to be like. So infantry it was. And one of the things I like about Phil Mugford is he, number one, still to this day, if I come across something where I've got some kind of ethical or moral dilemma, I think, what would Phil Mugford do here? The other thing I like about the guy is, of course, he, as an RTC instructor, he was 8 years into his career, so probably early 30s. And when I was starting Ranger School at Fort Benning as a second lieutenant, still in my early 20s, and with the resilience that youth provides, when I was going into the Central Issue Facility to get some of the equipment for Ranger School, Ranger Phil Mugford was coming out. He had just finished Ranger School. Okay. And I thought that's a pretty gutsy move for a guy his age. I know people have gone to Ranger School later in life, but that, for me, that was proof that this guy was the real thing.
Yeah. What is Ranger School? What does that entail?
So Ranger School, first I'll tell you, anybody you talk to who's been through Ranger School, they will tell you they were in the toughest class that there was. And that was certainly true of my class. It was clearly the toughest one anybody went through. But Ranger School actually hasn't changed a whole lot since its inception in the early 50s. There have been modifications based on changes in the world environment and things like that, but it's about 8 weeks of very intense training. It's a leadership course. But what they try and do is take you as close to absolute exhaustion as they can and then force you to lead. So when I went through Ranger School, there was the first week was then called City Week, and essentially that was a whole lot of physical work, not much sleep. It was how bad do you want to be here kind of thing. Then you went to Camp Darby, which is just at the edge of Fort Benning, and you started learning to patrol. And so you were in a tactical environment. And then you went to the mountains in Dahlonega, Georgia. You learned some mountaineering techniques, and then again, patrolling in the mountains. At that time, in the early 80s, we also had a desert phase. So we flew to Fort Bliss, Texas, right on the border between Fort Bliss and White Sands. You spent a week in the desert. And then we jumped into Florida at Eglin Air Force Base. And you spent about 2.5 weeks there. Excuse me, but Ranger School remains one of the Army's, and maybe one of the military's premier leadership courses. And a friend of mine says, Ranger School teaches you to be hard. If you are hard, it teaches you to be harder.
Right. So you graduate Ranger School. Are you now an Army Ranger, or how does that? I'm assuming a lot of people do that, but aren't Rangers, correct?
Yeah. So there's, I will tell you, there's 2 kinds of Rangers, if you will. There are those who are Ranger qualified. We wear a Ranger tab on our left shoulder, and what it means is we've graduated from Ranger School. There are also Rangers in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and you'll hear all kinds of debate about, are you a real Ranger or not? I will tell you from my perspective, if you have served in the regiment or if you're Ranger qualified, if you've been through the course, I'm happy to call you a Ranger. And I think some of that debate is a little petty, and we should actually celebrate each other's accomplishments instead of tearing each other down there.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Cold War. What years are you in Germany?
So I finished Ranger School. I was one of those folks that got to do the mountains twice. Got frostbite the first time through. Danny Priatko and I emerged from patrol, got our feet checked, and you look down at your toes, you see they're blue, and you think, well, that's different. We got recycled and got to go back to what is euphemistically called the Gulag at Fort Benning while we waited for the next class. But I graduated on Valentine's Day, 1985. And my wife still on Valentine's Day will give me black and gold flowers or things like that. But I got to Germany and was assigned to 4th Battalion, 8th Infantry in Mannheim, Germany, in the 8th Infantry Division. And
this is 85.
That's correct, yeah. Ended up staying there about 3 years, was a platoon leader, a support platoon leader, somebody responsible for the fuel, food, ammunition, transportation of the battalion. I was a company executive officer, the second in command, if you will, of a company of about 130 soldiers. And then I was an assistant ops officer, an assistant S3 before I left. But during that period of time, almost as soon as you got to Germany, when you occupied a leadership position, you went up to the border, and there was a sector for which your outfit, whatever size it was responsible to defend. And I remember as a second lieutenant full of passion and moxie and not a whole lot of context, our platoon position was just east of Fulda, Germany, just north of a small town called Hofbieber. And I still periodically will look at the map and remember that's the right flank, that's the left flank, and here's where we expect that BTR 60 regiment to come across the border.
So the time the Soviets are the enemy, that's what you're there to defend.
Yeah, and it was there was a clarity to it, because there was essentially one adversary, and you were focused on that. Certainly, we were in Germany. It was a frightening thought, though, to think about having to go to war there. I still remember early in my lieutenancy coming to the conclusion that, if somebody really wants to, for instance, the right flank of this platoon position I'm talking about was on a piece of high ground. If somebody concentrates a converging sheaf of 152 artillery there, I don't care how well you're dug in, probably not going to live through it. And it was an interesting point, I think, in my maturation as an Army officer, particularly an infantry officer, to understand how you do it is important, maybe even critical, but that's not the only determinant in whether things work out well. Fortune plays a role.
Right, right. How real was the threat, either perceived or real, for you and the soldiers that you commanded? How real was that threat? Was it something that, you know, every day you worried about, or was it just those guys over there, they're not coming over here?
Yeah, I don't know that we thought that much about the strategic aspects of it, about whether we should expect a conflict or not, because I believe we were all focused on the standards we had to meet. When I was a platoon leader, 2 hours after whoever called the alert, we had to be ready to roll out the gate. As a support platoon leader, 90 minutes after whoever called the alert, we had to be ready to roll out the gate, because we would go pick up the ammunition for the battalion and then bring it back and distribute it. So when you focus on that set of standards, you know, you really got to think through, how do we recall people before the era of a cell phone? Who does what? How do you expeditiously accomplish this set of tasks in order to meet the mission requirements? And once, I want to tell you, it was once a quarter, we would take all the leadership up to the border, sometimes in our tracked vehicles, sometimes just in wheeled vehicles. And we would do a reconnaissance of our position. We would look at where we were going to establish a defense. We would consider whether we wanted to request more obstacles to be in. We'd look through how we would dispose ourselves as we moved back and bought time for other elements of the Army to move into Europe. So just the standards we faced were the things I think caused us to focus. You know, like I told you before, there was a BTR 60 regiment that was what had been templated to be in our sector at first. And so, and that's what I was focused on. I never really thought about who's the platoon leader over there in that BTR 60 regiment, and are they really going to come across the board? Any incidents that stand out, or was it? So I will tell you, I don't know if it was an incident, but we were blessed that one of the battalion's commanders I had over there was a guy named Dick Girding. Dick Girding remains to this day probably the best pure leader I've ever met. He did what he thought needed to be done at any given time, and he was incredibly intuitive about leadership. He was a great guy. He could laugh and he could chew you out. He was every day he showed up for work, he was motivated. But he was also somebody who would make clear to you when you'd done something poorly. For a short period of time, I was the acting commander of a company, and I hadn't been there in the morning, and so our senior platoon leader had led the company doing physical training. We were used to having whoever's leading a run out in front of the formation, along with a guidon and then the columns of soldiers. Well, this platoon leader at the time, he had grown up differently, where the officer in charge would run abreast of the leaders of those three columns. Not that big a difference, except that Colonel Girding had seen this formation out running with nobody in charge. At least that's what he perceived. So as soon as he saw me that day, he got about this far away from me and said, "Look, I'm not going to put up with that anymore." I mean, I had no idea what he was talking about, so I hightailed it back to figure out what was going on and then explained it to him. But for him, that was important. There was another time that he said, "Look, when you're running in formation, you do not say anything bad about any other unit out there. They're all members of our team." He said, "I'm not going to put up with that." In fact, he told me about a time when he was younger when he actually got into a fight with a fellow company commander when they had done something like that. But not necessarily an incident per se, but it was something that really influenced me in my career.
Yeah. What are your thoughts when you hear that the wall had come down and the Soviet Union, as we know it, is gone?
Yeah, well, I had already left Germany, had gone to the advanced course, and was a company commander at Fort Campbell. So we were still largely, not universally, but largely focused on how we would help the fight in Europe, and drilled into us at the basic course and the advanced courses. Here's what a Russian formation looks like. Here's what a BTR 60 formation looks like in pre-battle formation. At this point in an attack. So to some extent, it was one of these, oh Lord, all this all this data I put in my head is now useless. I got to figure out a new framework. But it was also incredibly relieving. At least at the time, I think we all thought, okay, praise God, World War III is no longer a likelihood, maybe even a possibility.
Or at least delayed for
yes,
decades.
Yes. And so here we stand today. I just saw a friend of mine on LinkedIn pointing out that, 30, 40 years ago, I learned these formations and these graphics, and suddenly it's relevant again.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Gulf War. Let's fast forward. Different enemy, different environment completely.
Yes. And after the wall came down, our brigade began to focus on having to fight in Central or South America. We thought collectively, and our brigade commander in particular thought that was the next challenge. I thought the next big war was going to be fought in Africa over, valuable minerals and things like that. And so I remember my wife and I seated at home in early August of 1990, and both of us were company commanders. And we watched CNN, which was still that fledgling news network, that the Iraqi army had invaded Kuwait. And not long after that, CJ, my wife, CJ's, we didn't have cell phones. The phone rang. It was CJ's unit, and they had been alerted. So we quickly scrawled out this code. Green means the division's is at X hour. Blue means the division's at H hour. Pumpkin means this. And she went into work, and an hour and a half later called me with, blue pumpkin chimpanzee or whatever. And so very rapidly, not just our units in the 101st Airborne Division, but I think the whole Army had to relearn how to deploy a large formation. And CJ got there before I did. She was, I think, about a week before I did, she left. My sister came and stayed with our house and our two dogs. But just something as simple as that, of how soldiers ready their homes to deploy, is something we all had to learn. And something that, I think shows that the Army didn't really know how to deploy a large force is, we got there and we were unprepared as an enterprise to spend months in the desert. Not long after we got there, we tried to acclimate in terms of just the physical environment, and then we were focused on training. Well, we're an infantry unit. Let's go shoot. Let's do some marksmanship. Well, there's not that much ammunition in theater. And then, okay, we've got the ammunition. Let's go fire. Well, we don't have any targets. Well, okay, go get some copier paper. We got copier paper. We don't have, we're going to have to scroll on them with magic markers. And then we don't have any sticks to put them in the ground with. And then we don't have any staples. I mean, the really basic things. As an Army, I think we learned a lot in that deployment going over there, and making sure we were ready to fight when we had to.
Yeah. When do you deploy?
So let's see. CJ left the very end of August, and I left. I want to tell you it was the Sunday before Labor Day, because I recall our battalion was going in 2 flights on wide-body jets, and I remember being a little annoyed that the second flight got to watch Monday Night Football before they had to fly out. And we flew on a 747, that half of the battalion. I remember landing, and it was hotter than the hinges of hell. You got off the plane, somebody handed you a water bottle, and that was down your throat right away. Our assistant division commander at the time, Hugh Shelton, Brigadier Shelton, had gotten there early, called back and said, if you want to know what it's like, turn on your oven, stick your head in there, then turn on a hairdryer and blow that in your ear. But we got there in early September and immediately went into a large tent city that the division had set up, and it was in order to acclimate us. Almost as soon as we had become physically acclimated, it was off into the desert to start training, getting used to that environment. There was also an interesting mix of culture there. The first time we went out into the desert to train, we were on double-decker buses. And so an infantry company took about 2 double-decker buses. We went out to the appointed location, got off the bus, and in Army style, there were soldiers supervised by team leaders and squad leaders that cleared all the trash off each of the buses. There was a platoon sergeant with his hands on his hips watching this go on. The trash was collected, consolidated, and it was handed to one of the bus drivers, who smiled in appreciation and heaved it into the desert. And so that was one of those, yeah, okay, different perspectives, got it. We had been accustomed to wandering around in a swamp, in a forest, maybe someplace that was mountainous. The maps of Saudi Arabia were almost devoid of anything recognizable. Right. So walking in the sand, you end up taking more steps than you would in the forest or somewhere else. So it really took a long time to figure out how to do appropriate navigation. And I still remember when each company got one Slugger that could talk to the satellites. And apparently there were only a few satellites up then, because you would be moving through the desert and your fires officer would tell you, well, we lost the satellite. And so this whole formation would pause and a soldier would stand in an awkward position trying to get that extra satellite. Right. It was also actually right before Desert Shield kicked off. We got the first lasers that you could connect to a rifle. We were carrying M16s, and the first lasers, NPAC-2s, I think was the abbreviation we used. It was the size of a good-sized Maglite with D-cell batteries. But you could slap it on the side of an M16 after you got the laser aligned with the barrel. Now at night you could tell the point of impact or close to it. So really a tremendous leap in technology that we got right before it all kicked off.
Yeah. So the air war is underway. What did you guys have a sense of how long that would last and when your turn would come?
Yeah, at my level, again, I was a company commander. I did not. I don't know that my brother company commanders did. The 5 of us in that battalion are still friends to this day and stay in touch. Excuse me, for a while we were doing annual reunions where we would get together and harass each other. And so we were very close at that time. Right. I don't think any of us had that great a strategic sense of what, not just what would happen, but what could happen. Our brigade was in Tent City in Camp Eagle in Dhahran when the air war started. And just by chance, earlier that day, I had gone on a run with Tim Fay, the Charlie Company commander, and we had decided to go to the payphones and make a call home. And that evening, our boss, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Kinnison, another great leader, had called us all together and said, okay, I want everybody sleeping below sandbag level tonight. We had sandbags around the tent, probably 4 to 5 high and 2 wide. And so I assumed that meant something was up. And then since we were at Dhahran airfield, there were a series of fighter jets and bombers that were there. And so there was clearly something afoot because there was a whole lot of activity there that night. Not long after that, our brigade was part of the big left hook. The 101st Airborne Division was way out west. So the plan was that once the air war started, it would fix the Iraqi army, and that's when 18th Airborne Corps and the 101st Airborne Division would move west. So we prepared to fly out there and C-130s land at a airfield called Rafah, Saudi Arabia. And I remember getting on a plane, getting everything working out. I was one of the lead members of the battalion going up there, so I could go meet our quartering party in the assembly area we were going to occupy. The plane took off, went up there, went around some, and came back. Apparently the weather wasn't going to work well. We didn't want to, as I understand it, we didn't want to use radar at that airfield to telegraph that a large force was landing there. So now I come back and I get queued for the next flight to go up there. And I got into one of the trucks that was going to be on the flight, so nobody's going to leave me. But I was dog tired, and so I went to sleep. I went to sleep with Tim Fay in the vehicle too. And we both promised each other we'd wake each other up. Well, I woke up and Tim Fay wasn't there. He'd hopped on an earlier flight and had taken off. So I ended up as the last flight out of King Fahd Airport. I landed at Rafah and I went up to my boss and said, "Sir, I apologize. I know I was supposed to be one of the first guys here. I'm sorry I'm the last." He says, No, this is the second flight that's landed. We're having all kinds of trouble getting aircraft to land. So hopped in a vehicle, took as much of the company was there, met the great Sergeant Chris Gambots, who had been on emergency leave and shows up at Rafah, Saudi Arabia. Sergeant Gambots, good to see you. Grab your crap. And we drove out into the desert. It was one of these where you drove to a spot on Tapline Road, about the only paved road in the area, turned left, and went into the desert, you know, hoping that you're on the right azimuth, trying to look at the Slugger anytime you can. And we got there. Our quartering party was there, having generally identified an assembly area. As the rest of the company showed up, we started preparing a defensive position. We noted, much to our dismay, that in this particular area, you dug down 6 or 8 inches and you hit bedrock. So 6 or 8 inches isn't deep enough for a fighting position. So we dig down to the bedrock and then build up with sandbags, which was, you know, no pleasant accomplishment. But we ended up establishing a defensive position, you know, in coordination with the rest of the battalion, and then periodically would see the aircraft flying north or coming back south. I do have a story about that. Again, we company commanders were very tight. We were also, I think we were competent, we were also fairly arrogant. And so there are positives and negatives about that. But one morning at about 4 a.m., we heard a huge explosion just off left front and then some automatic weapons fire. All the companies went to 100% security, and we company commanders would talk back and forth. At the time, we just had wired communication. I think Alexander Graham Bell would have recognized the level of technology that we had. And we would periodically report back to our higher headquarters, which was literally 1,700 meters, because I remember from the Slugger, that's exactly where it is. And we stayed at 100% security, the company commanders talking to each other, moving our observation posts around in front of us. And the sun had come up, and it was about 8 o'clock, and I called our higher headquarters, and I said, hey, we're still 100% security. Please tell us what's going on. And the answer I got, at least the way I interpreted it, was a little bit sarcastic of, you know, I don't know why you guys are doing that. Yeah, okay. So I was a little annoyed with that, and I went to the Bravo Company commander, Tom Jardine, who to this day remains my best friend. And I said, you know, Tom, I think the staff at next to our headquarters is screwing us. I may have used a term other than screwing, right. But and he said, I agree with you. And I said, look, I'm going to talk to the colonel about it this afternoon. So this is actually a story not about my maturity, but about loyalty and you know, Tom Jardine's willingness to go along with what he said. So at our kind of daily meeting, the company commanders there, the staff's there, the battalion commander. And typically what happens is after everybody's talk, it's the battalion commander's turn to talk. So we had finished everybody else speaking. The battalion commander said, hey, anybody got anything to say? You know, we're a team here. We're one family. What's on everybody's mind? I said, well, sir, I have something to talk to you about afterwards. And he says, no, Joe, go ahead. Say it now. Okay. I said, sir, the staff's screwing us. And again, there may have been more colorful language. And I had inhaled to offer a supporting argument. And Colonel Hank Kinnison, again, great guy, very calm, a guy who I still call, you know, sir to this day. The top of his head blew off. He grew another head, laser shot from his eye sockets. And he informed me in very specific terms that I wasn't all that hot myself. And by God, if he had somebody else he could put in command of Alpha Company, he would. And maybe I didn't know what the hell was going on, and I didn't appreciate what the battalion staff did, and my arrogance knew no limits. And after he had reached a training heart rate for a little bit of informing me of this, I was the Alpha Company commander. He turned to Tom Jardine, who was the Bravo Company commander, and said, Tom, do you have anything to say? And Tom stood up and he said, yes, sir, Joe's right, the staff's screwing us. Well, Colonel Kinnison did not, properly, he did not interpret this as an appropriate response. And so he then informed Tom and me of the limits of our capabilities and the heights of our arrogance. And then he turned to Tim Fay and said, Tim, do you have anything to say? And Tim, probably maturely, he said, "Sir, I thought it was your turn to speak." The Delta Company commander wasn't there that day. He was off someplace else. His executive officer was there, Dave Whidden. And he told me later, Kevin Nixon was the Delta Company commander. He had asked his executive officer later on that night, "So what happened at the meeting today?" And Dave Whidden said, "Well, sir, I think you need to talk to the other company commanders about it." It was significant. But that was, you certainly get some humor sometimes, and that was one of them.
Yeah, I guess you need that.
Yeah. Well, and another time, I think we had a great S3, operations officer, Gary Schomburg. And I still remember getting the little ring on the phone, picking it up, and Gary Schomburg on the other side saying, 90 tanks, this grid, heading south. Okay. I thought that was, an odd report, but nonetheless, I got out all the maps and tried to plot the grid and looked at it, and okay, that's not far away, and they're heading south. And we still just had what they called 2 accompanied troops ammunition, so a little less than a magazine, certainly no anti-tank weapons. And I think all the company commanders on the line figured it out about the same time, because Corporal Brown, our supply assistant, went driving a Humvee at warp factor 2 toward the field trains where the ammunition was stored. And I think Dave Pound was our headquarters company commander who was responsible for that. And he told me later, on the horizon, he just sees these like 4 or 5 trails of vehicles heading for him at high rate of speed. Don't even stop to check in, just go straight to the ammo and throwing it on. And he said something like, "What in the hell's going on?" People told him, he said, "Well, start throwing ammo in there." And I still remember, in our company command post, sort of in my mind's eye, seeing Corporal Brown come flying over the top of positions like Santa Claus, heaving anti-tank weapons out to the soldiers. It turned out to be, and I'm quoting here, a spurious report. But it told me something about the soldiers in the company. There wasn't so much angst about what was going to happen, but really almost a frustration that we weren't going to get onto it. I remember one of the squad leaders, First Sergeant Zeb Hill and I would take turns walking the line periodically. And I found this guy out there just tapping his foot, looking at the horizon. And I said, "Hey, how you doing, partner?" And he said, "So, I think what's going to happen is we're probably going to get a platoon of tanks coming through here. There's going to be supporting fires over there. That's going to be hard to suppress, but those guys are dead." And then and so the soldiers who had, by now, they'd been in the desert 5 or 6 months. I mean, they were fairly low on Maslow's hierarchy, and they were tough, motivated, and I didn't see any fear or apprehension. The worst I saw was resignation that this was going to have to happen. And in some of them, it was anxious, not so much that they got to go destroy things or kill people, but anxious that they got to go prove that they could handle this, and they were going to acquit themselves well.
You mentioned a term a few times, slugger. What is that? Explain what that is.
So nowadays, I mean, I didn't buy a watch that'll tell me where I am, but they're certainly available. Right. My phone will tell me where I am. At that point in time, I don't even think I'd heard the term GPS. Well, a slugger was something that was the size of a good-sized hardbound book, and it would allow you to triangulate where you were using the satellite constellation that was in the air. So now where every soldier may have a Garmin in their hand that they can use to do that. When we first deployed, we had a map, a compass, and a pace count. And as I told you, in the desert, not all that easy to figure that stuff out. But the Slugger was another one of those technological advancements that when we went way out west, and when we conducted what at the time was the longest air assault in history, landing 140 miles into Iraq, we knew where we were. We could also know where other friendly units were. It was almost one of those dreams come true. And frankly, after we got it, we had a hard time maintaining discipline. Okay, what's your pace count? I didn't think we needed to track that anymore. Don't you have the thing? Right. But it was, it was one element of technology that I think really put us head and shoulders over that adversary. Because they used to get lost when they go out in the desert, so they didn't.
Right. What did you know about the Iraqi Army? What were you told about their capabilities, how formidable they may or may not be?
So I think not unlike other adversaries, we ended up making them 10 feet tall. And that's not all bad. You got to be careful that you don't believe your adversary is Superman or Superwoman. You know, they have their challenges and trials too. After a while, we began doing these mounted patrols up to the de facto border. The map I had when we deployed after the air war started showed that we were actually in Iraq with the UN recognized border, but the de facto border for us was on an escarpment further north. We stayed a kilometer away because we didn't want to initiate any contact, but we saw a series of outposts that were there. The one in particular in our area looked to be in a mobile home, and since it was on an escarpment, you couldn't see it all that well. But we thought, look, before we conduct the main attack, we're going to have to conduct a raid and destroy that outpost. So we were paying pretty good attention to it, and we'd started thinking about, how if we were there, it would be a raid, the sophistication that they must have. And on one of the patrols I had gone up there with, I was looking through my binoculars, and we had moved up there in the darkness, and the sun had come up and had been up a little while. And I thought, I was thinking to myself, well, that trailer must be the command post. There's unseen positions up here. We've got to try and figure out where they are. And 30 minutes later, the door to the trailer kicked open. There was somebody naked from the waist up, who stretched and then relieved himself out the door. And I thought, okay, these are guys that have been placed on the border. I'm sure they're doing their duty well, but they're not necessarily at the level that we might have suspected that they were. I think the individuals in the Iraqi Army, I'm certain, were dedicated and disciplined, but candidly, as a force, I think we made them into more than they were. One specific example of that occurred on the 20th of February of 1991. The way our division planned to attack is 1st Brigade was going to move on the first day of the ground war. They would fly about 40 miles into Iraq and, for lack of a better term, establish a huge gas station. As various staff officers started to do the math, they figured out that they couldn't fly everything up there. They needed to have a ground element that followed. And as they charted the course for the ground element, they saw an Iraqi Army organization, a unit, in the way. So our battalion was tasked to do an air assault raid and to destroy that element. And this is 4 days. It was supposed to execute 4 days before the ground war was going to start. So for a series of days, we rehearsed this. Tom Jardine, his company, Bravo Company, would lead with 2 rifle platoons. Alpha Company, our company, would follow with 2 infantry platoons and an engineer platoon. To be honest, I can't remember if Tom had an engineer platoon with him or not. We were going to do an air assault raid with an artillery battery and have attack helicopters for fire support. We were told it was a reinforced platoon of about 50 Iraqi soldiers. And so, we were going to execute the next morning at dawn. I finished the last personal preparations, decided I needed to get some rest so I could get up early and be ready to go. And we got a call again on this telephone, and said, no, decision's been made at division level that instead of doing the raid, we'll develop the situation with some air power. So I thought, okay, fine. Next morning I got up. We had a pretty high antenna established, so I tried tuning to the various division command channels to see if I could hear anything. And I didn't hear anything. So at about noon, I thought, man, I'm really tired. I'm going to get some rest. We're not far off from the ground war kicking off. Last thing we want to do is go into that tired. Just as I was about to lay my head down and get some rest, Tom Jardine's company, which had been about a kilometer back from where we were with some Black Hawk helicopters, we hear the helicopters start up and they fly north. Now, no regular Army forces had been north at that time that I was aware of, certainly not in our area. So I thought that was a little bit strange, or at least unique. So I picked up the phone and, cranked it and got the battalion operations center. And I said, hey, this is Captain Buche. And all I heard was, get to the PZ, the pickup zone. And then nothing. Okay. Hung up the phone, told our executive officer, the great Dan Hoffman, and First Sergeant Zeb Hill, wonderful teammate, First Sergeant. Okay, get everybody and everything and meet me at the PZ as soon as you can. And Corporal Lyons, our driver, and I hopped in the Humvee and went up the pickup zone. There were Chinook helicopters, the big ones with the 2 rotors landing and taking off. There was an artillery major that came up to me, handed me a sling set, the thing you use to convey equipment below a helicopter, and said, sling out the ZSU, which is an AAA, anti-air artillery Soviet weapon. Okay, threw that in a Chinook, and about the time the rest of the company shows up, my boss and his team, Colonel Hank Kinnison, shows up and he says, listen, it seems like there's a few more than 50. Tom's company should be on the ground soon. We're following them in. Don't know much more about the situation. Sure, got it. Split up the company under the different Chinooks and took off flying. It wasn't that far in. It was 20, 25 miles. But every so often, I remember Colonel Kinnison gesturing to me in the helicopter, so I would stagger up there, and he would say something like, okay, it's not 50, it's more like 100 Iraqis that are there. And I'd go back and I'd tell the people on my aircraft and get another gesture. Joe, it's more than 100, maybe 150 that are there. Make a long story short, it was 500. It was just less than a battalion. Fortunately, most of them were not interested in fighting. If anybody did want to fight, you'd make contact, you'd exchange a little individual weapons fire, get out a mirror, signal an Apache or a Cobra, make contact with them. They would suppress, and then the surrender flags would come up. So we spent the rest of that day just trying to figure out what was going on, get soldiers, Iraqi soldiers onto Chinooks, flying back to the division's prisoner of war cage. And so our 3rd platoon, led by Greg Saulitis, Lieutenant Greg Saulitis, and Sergeant First Class Willie Crawford, were responsible for securing prisoners to go back there. Just as the sun was coming down, decision was made at a very high level that we weren't going to keep U.S. soldiers on the ground in Iraq overnight. This was when the Russians were still working a peace initiative there at the last minute. So we all flew back. We were going back the next morning, and God bless Lieutenant Saulitis and Sergeant Crawford, because somehow they made it back from the division POW cage to our company position. I think because my boss and his ops officer knew about that, we were the last ones to fly out the next morning. The Bravo Company and Charlie Company were on the ground. We landed and were directed to go in this cardinal direction. We want to search all the positions. Because you can learn a lot if you look at an enemy's fighting position. If you go into the position and it's actually neat. If it's an automatic weapon and you can open the feed tray cover on the top of the machine gun, and there's enough room at the top to open it so you can change, reload a belt of ammunition. What can you see out of there? Did they build it so there's a whole lot of dead space? In other words, somebody could crawl up to it without being engaged or not. So searching it is a key point of exploiting this thing. We headed off in this direction, 2nd platoon and the engineer platoon in this direction, 3rd platoon in that direction. And I heard an explosion and some automatic weapons fire. So, okay, got the company and command group down with me. It's a fairly unwieldy group, and waited for a report. Didn't really get one for a while, so I called the platoon leader and said, hey, brother, what's up? And he said, please don't worry about it. Okay. Several seconds later, another explosion, more rifle fire. So this time I didn't wait as long. I called back and said, okay, something is happening. And he said, look, one of our squad leaders is clearing the positions. He's not necessarily searching them. And so, okay, that's on me. I should have made it very clear we're not clearing them, throwing in a grenade, entering with automatic fire. Because that tends to diminish the intelligence value of the position. But I made it clear to the platoon leader, hey, I'm not really happy anyway, and this is not helping me with that happiness. So he agreed he would get under control, and seemingly immediately after, another explosion and rifle fire. So I was just livid. Now, 2nd Platoon was over here, and Corporal Lyons, the guy I told you about before, had the radio, and he was with our executive officer. He had listened to all this, and apparently at this time he told people, hey, come here and listen to this. This is going to be good. And I got on the radio, and I called the platoon leader, and he responded, and I made very clear to him, this is unsatisfactory. I don't know what the hell's going on over there, but by God, let's get this in me. If I got to go over there myself, you get the idea. I found out later, the platoon leader, to his credit, here's the explosion, here's me call, he answers, hands it to his radio telephone operator, the guy hitting the radio, and says, when he's done screaming at me, say Roger. And then he took off running to make sure that everything was understood. Well, by now I'm really frustrated. It seems to me I hadn't provided enough detail and clarity to our team, and so things weren't working very well. So I saw an Iraqi position 15 meters in front of me, and I thought, I'm going to go look at it. I want a first-hand account. And the position was facing away. So I walked up to the entrance at the back, and they had put some sandbags down, empty sandbags, I think as shade from the sun. So I flipped up the sandbags and took one step down to the first step into it. And fortunately for me, Staff Sergeant Jimmy Dean Roden had moved off to the right side and taken up a prone position. Because as soon as I did that, I heard the distinct noise of his selector lever going from safe to semi. And I remember him saying, Jesus Christ, there's somebody in there. So I leapt back. We had just gotten a new holster that it was Cordura, so you actually had to put your thumb in it, push down, and then lift the flap up from the leather holsters. Right. And so I leapt back, trying to jerk my .45 out of the holster, and just having no luck. And 3 Iraqis emerged from this position. And if you think about it from their perspective, yesterday, hell came to breakfast. You know, the whole place, there's explosions, there's automatic weapons fire, they can see people being carried away. I don't know if they were in that position, got overlooked, or they gathered overnight. And now, the next morning, people came back. All night there was activity overhead. Right. And what have they heard? Explosions and rifle fire. So I'm pretty sure they thought it was the end of days. But Sergeant Roden got them all prone, searched them all, and then he had been the guy from the company that had flown to Saudi Arabia about a week before to go buy goodies. He had come back with these chocolate bars that just tasted terrible. So we told Sergeant Roden, you're stuck with those, brother. He gave him this bad-tasting candy bar. And so you saw the first guy get searched, and then somebody puts a candy bar in front of him, and he's like, I don't know if I want to be. So somebody, the interpreter says, no, you can eat that. So he's thinking, okay. This is about the time where the second guy happens. He gives him the candy bar. These 2 guys are now telling us everything. Hey, that's where my company commander's position is. There's an officer position over here. You got to make sure you get him. They just started talking about everything. And so that my accidentally capturing 3 Iraqi POWs, I got our company's booby prize for the war. Right. The stupidest thing that anybody did was my award.
Right. What's it like? So you may not even have thought about this at the time. You're now in combat where you're facing an enemy that wants to kill you. All the training that you've gone through, all the books that you've read and courses you've taken, and now you're in it. Is there any sense of, are you aware of all this, or is it just I'm doing a job and I'll think about it later?
So I don't, this comes across with a sense of bravado that's unintended and unmerited. But early on I decided, you know, if you deploy into a theater of war, prepare yourself before you go so that you're not coming back. Both CJ and I wrote out a letter to our next of kin or to each other that was really sort of administrative. Hey, here's the kind of funeral I'd like, here's where I'd like to be buried. Like I say, almost administrative. And we had made sure that financially we had, you know, taken care of either of each other or whoever's left for the house and the dogs. And then that mindset carried on, at least for me while I was there. There were 2 things I think that does for you. And number one, if you really have that mindset, it helps you prevent avoiding dangerous things. Because you've already told yourself, you know, you're prepared not to come back. So, hey, if you do get to come back, what a great deal. The other thing is when you do come back, it's even sweeter. So at least for me personally, I certainly tried not to think about mortality. But it did, and other folks in the company told me this, that it's amazing, your first time you deploy to a theater of war, you think that everything's going to change, that people are going to behave differently, and most of us don't. If somebody is skating, you know, in peacetime, they'll probably behave about the same way as they are. People in our company, we had one guy fall asleep when he was in an observation post out in front of a defensive position. There was another young man who decided his anti-tank weapon was too heavy and left it behind. And he received some personal supervision from Sergeant First Class Ricky Wilder after that occurred. That was certainly an important lesson, but I didn't notice anybody, certainly after we'd been there a while, I found everybody behaved about the way they had before. I thought the vast majority of the American soldiers I came in touch with were entirely professional, focused on a mission and each other. That's not to say that there weren't some surprises. In our mortar section, Corporal McClellan, a very quiet man, competent, rarely spoke. He got a Valorous Award. We made contact when the war began for real, and we were moving around this huge pump station. And he was the assistant gunner. Well, one of the responsibilities for that is putting up aiming stakes. So while the rest of us, after we made contact, had sought cover, not him, he walked out toward the fire, put his back to the people firing, put the aiming stake in, and waited for direction from his squad leader about whether he needed to move left or right. And so it's not that I wouldn't have expected that from him, but here was a guy who didn't make a lot of noise, wasn't one of the guys out front yelling all the time, and when stuff sort of figuratively hit the fan, he was unfazed. He did his job and didn't really care that people were shooting at him from the back.
Did you know much about what was going on with your wife? You've got a unique situation. You're both deployed.
Yeah. We saw each other periodically during Desert Shield. You know, when I accidentally ran into 3 Iraqis, that story sort of snowballed, and since she was in the aviation brigade, some of the pilots who had flown us were friends of mine, and it got to be a larger story as it worked its way back to her. And then I told my boss as Desert Storm was going on, but before the ground war started, you know, do you mind if I go find CJ for a day? And he said, no, you know, pick a quiet day, make sure your XO's squared away, and, you know, make sure we know what you're up to and where you're going. Sir, I got it. So one day I didn't necessarily differentiate it from the one before, the one after. It looked like it was going to be quiet. We weren't responsible for many major actions. I told First Sergeant Hill and Lieutenant Hoffman, hey, I'm going to go visit my wife. Boss said it was okay. I'll be back this evening sometime. Here's, you know, what I know. Here's the radio frequencies I'll be on. And Corporal Lyons and I got in a Humvee, and what we did is we headed south toward Tapline Road, that paved road, and then we looked for helicopters to see where they were flying. And it looked like there's some going over there and landing, so we drove that way. And we'd come across an American unit, and we'd say, hey, is this HHC, 101st Aviation Brigade? No. Do you know where they are? I have no idea. Okay, let's go over there. And finally we found them, and you know, we drove in, and I told Corporal Lyons, hey, killer, I love you. Get lost for a couple hours. And he apparently wandered around telling people that he was just back from the front, and was admonished for having a magazine in his weapon. You know, what are you doing with that magazine in your weapon? Because neither one of us had thought about that. Yeah, we got a magazine in our weapon. But I walked into the tent where CJ was, and she had her back to me. And she was talking to somebody, so I waited, and she turned and looked at me and then looked away. And I thought, well, that's odd. And she told me later she thought it was, well, it looks like Joe, but he's not here. And then a moment or two later, she turns around and hugs me, and then she says, I knew you'd show up on Valentine's Day. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly why I'm here today. I've been planning this for a long time, sweetie. So that was, once Desert Storm started, that was the only time we saw each other until, I think after the 101st had all gone back to King Fahd field. I think we saw each other, but I'm not sure. I know, that we came back within several hours of each other just by chance, and so that was good for families because they didn't have to wait at the airfield that long.
Were you surprised at how quickly the ground war progressed and then ended? I won't say it was simple. People lost their minds, but it was relatively quick.
I think we had made the enemy more competent than they were. I don't think we knew how good we were as an enterprise. You've heard me here. There's this inter-service rivalry that goes on. I harass pilots all the time, but nobody is happier to be teamed up with the world's greatest Air Force than an infantryman in the same nation. And the Air Force performance was magnificent, and so we should have had an inkling that it was going to be easier. I know at the higher levels we retimed the two attacks because there was a perception that the first attack into Saudi Arabia, into Kuwait itself, was going more quickly than had been thought. So in fact, our brigade had been scheduled not to leave until the sun had gone down. We ended up moving it forward several hours and landing right as the sun was going down. I think, at least from my perspective, we were burdened by, here's our perspective, here's what we see, here's what we know. The first night when 3rd Brigade had gone in, our artillery and our anti-tank weapons, just based on the capabilities of the helicopters, couldn't get all the way up to where the dismounted infantry was going. So they landed about 40 miles south. And then they were going to drive, ideally they were going to drive and link up with us right when the dismounted infantry had landed. Well, it turned out they got stuck in the mud. We landed in a little bit of rain. Tim Fay's company was the lead company, Charlie Company. They cleared this pump station. And don't think about a gas station, think about 4 to 8 city blocks of pump station. Our company went around the edge. We had that contact that I talked to you about, and then we went and seized a small airstrip that we thought might have some Iraqi helicopters on it. And we were supposed to then move about 3 more kilometers out to a battle position, but we got directed not to go. I didn't know it at the time, but 2 things had happened. One is our artillery and our anti-tank weapons, weren't going to arrive that night. And 2, apparently General Shelton had called our brigade commander, Colonel Bobby Clark, and said, moving target indicators, it seems that there is a heavy Iraqi division headed up Highway 8 towards your brigade. Weather's pretty bad. I don't think you're going to get much air support. Good luck. And so one of the reasons I think we were stopped there just after the airfield and told to set up a defensive position was a concern that we wanted to stay fairly consolidated if we didn't have artillery and heavy anti-tank weapons. Then, the next day, 3rd Platoon cleared one of the few paved routes to 2nd Battalion. Everybody had about an hour's worth of sleep. They go on this 12-kilometer move. 2nd Platoon and our reserve platoon, the mortar section, move out to the battle position, start to prepare it. Our tow platoon, the heavy anti-tank weapons, they were man-packing, carrying 2 systems almost 4 kilometers out to the position with ammunition, which is a Herculean task. We probably should have got them evaluated for mental unfitness just because they were doing it, but incredibly tough behavior. We finally got the company consolidated that evening, got the position prepared, and candidly, I can't remember if it was the next morning or not, but then this monsoon hit us. Soldiers' fighting positions filled with water and didn't drain. And so these troopers in this monsoon, hey, get up, move about a meter, redig the fighting position. So I know that's not precisely responsive to your question, but to me I was really impressed with how these universally young men responded to hardship, and were, like I said, they were low on Maslow's hierarchy, right, but man, were they tough.
Was there a sense that when the fighting was halted that you should have kept going all the way to Baghdad and finished this thing for good? Or?
I don't think we really knew what was going on, again, strategically. I had a shortwave radio that I had brought with me, and we listened to BBC when we could. You know, our higher headquarters told us as much as they knew about what was going on in the rest of the theater. We were the unit in Central Command, the ground unit closest to Baghdad, and I presume could have been part of a move up there either to isolate Baghdad. You know, hopefully nobody had been considering, you know, going into Baghdad and trying to clear it. That would, you know, if ordered, we certainly would have tried to acquit ourselves as best we could. That would have been a messy operation.
Yeah. Who gets home first, you or your wife?
She beat me home by a few hours, which was okay because she left first. She got home, I think it was the morning. I landed in the afternoon. And so we had to, both organizations had to go back to their barracks, secure our weapons. You know, we give the threat brief to the soldiers. Okay, you're getting to go home. You're coming back though, so let's avoid all these pitfalls. I think most of our troopers just wanted to go sleep some.
Right. Let's fast forward a few years. September 11th, 2001. Tell us about that day, what you remember about it.
CJ and I and our daughters had flown back from vicinity Fort Campbell, where we still owned a house. We've been working on it. Had flown back to Hawaii, where we were assigned on September 10th. Okay. How lucky we were that we flew on September 10th and not September 11th, because I don't think we'd have gotten back to our units for weeks. But we still had a day of leave left. I remember getting up in the morning, probably 7 a.m. in Hawaii, so 1 o'clock on the East Coast. And my mom calling and saying, "Oh my God, Joe, what's going on there?" And I said, "Well, Mom, we're getting up, taking the kids to school. What's going on there?" And she said, "Oh my God, turn on the TV." So turned on the TV, took the kids to school. And then there was this momentary debate about, oh God, do I go into work? I still got a day of leave left. But it was one of these, no, I got to go. I was the Assistant Division Operations Officer, the Deputy G3, and my wife was the Garrison Executive Officer. So she would become very involved in securing Schofield Barracks, which had open access until then. And then, you know, I was responsible for helping the G3 with the operations of the division. I got there, and Lieutenant Colonel Tom Vail was there. He was the G3. And it was easy for him to determine that he was the senior lieutenant colonel and I was a junior one. So we said, hey, we got to go to, I can't remember what it was. I think it was DEFCON 3. We got to go to DEFCON 3. Figure out how to do it. I don't know how to go to DEFCON. Fortunately, I found a guy who'd been there forever. So, oh, that's easy. Here's the things we have to do. We'll do that. And Tom Vail and I, over the next few days, I became sort of the night lieutenant colonel and he became the day G3. You know, the division in Hawaii was fairly low on the Army's priority scale, but you know, we were getting ready to go to war because the President said, hey, get ready. And interestingly enough, it was the first night where I'd convinced Colonel Vail, hey, look, man, I don't need to be here from, I don't know, 2100 to 04. Nothing happens. How about I show up 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. I make sure that the brief to the commanding general for the morning is squared away. We can both do stuff that we need to do during the day. You know, I can leave a little earlier than you do. You can stay a little later than I did. But, you know, we have some really excellent majors on the division staff. If something goes awry, they'll tell us. This was the first night I had convinced him of that. So I'm at home asleep and the phone rings at about midnight. And I wake up and I answer it, and it's one of the civilians that worked in headquarters and said, "You've got a classified message here." I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, there's a classified message for you." I said, "You got to be kidding me. You know, this, that just doesn't happen." And he says, yeah, it did. I said, well, okay. You know, I'm going to be in there in a few hours. I'll read it then. And I thought, this has got to be some screw up. So I'm just about to go back to sleep. The phone rings again. It's the chief of ops for the division, really sharp major, one of the guys that was taking care of things that night. And he said, "Hey, sir, you got a classified message here." And I said, "I know. I'm trying to get a little sleep. I will come there and read it in a few hours." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he said, "You know, you've got to leave tonight." what? So I hung up the phone. CJ said, okay, tell me. I said, I don't know. So I got up, got dressed, went to division headquarters. We lived on Schofield Barracks, so it was a pretty short walk. And sure enough, there were 5 officers in the Army, 5 lieutenant colonels who were graduates of the School of Advanced Military Studies, who were being sent to Central Command to work on their plans team. In fact, the other infantryman, John Charlton, who retired a major general not long ago, John had been in my seminar in SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies. Okay, I'm thinking, good Lord, what is this? I had an old boss who was the 1-star at Fort Leavenworth, where the Command and General Staff College is, and I called him. I said, sir, you know, I saw my name on a message today that's classified. And he said, oh, I know. They called me and talked to me about it. I got to choose whose names were on that message. Well, sir, thanks a lot. So it directed me and all of us, all 5 of us, to report to Central Command, which is in Tampa, Florida, by a certain date. Well, that meant that I had to leave Hawaii that night to get there. So I called, got a hold of somebody at the J1, the Personnel Department, Central Command, and said, look, it's classified, so I can't talk about it specifically, but there was a requirement for me to arrive there tomorrow. Here are the problems in the way. Could I get a 2-day extension? Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, great. So fortunately for us, CJ's dad had been there visiting. We made a decision that our girls would leave with him and go stay with my sister. CJ was pretty involved, being the Garrison XO, doing security. I hopped on a plane, flew to Tampa, not really knowing what was going on. Fortunately, the Deputy J1 at Central Command was an old boss of mine, Colonel Jim Danley, still the best company commander I've ever met. I saw Colonel Danley and I said, so sir, I'm here. And he said, okay, you're the first one here. Do you want to go to J5 or J3? Oh, I want to go to J5, the plan shop. The guys that want to go to the op shop, that's fine. If I get a choice, send me to J5. So I spent the next almost 4 months down in Tampa as in the plans section. Delayed our move that we'd been ordered to take back to DC. CJ stayed in Hawaii. I got back right around the 1st of the year. We cleared our quarters, got 2 days in Maui to relax, and then flew to Chicago, picked up the girls, and flew to DC and started our next assignment.
Yeah. Did you have a sense on 9/11 of what that would mean? Another 20 years of war. Did the gravity of that day, was it apparent?
I certainly didn't think it was going to be 20 years of war. A guy named Mark Milley, whose name you may recognize, who's now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Mark Milley and I, at the time, for a short period of time, we were both lieutenant colonels. He was moving into the chief of staff's job at the division. And I remember being in a room with Mark Milley, General Carl Eikenberry, and 1 or 2 other people. And we were debating, what's this mean? And, there was this consensus, let's draw on a map. Okay. I think 18th Airborne Corps is going to do a movement of contact across Afghanistan. I think 3rd Corps is going to do a movement of contact across Iraq. Here's where other key large Army elements in this is going to be. But at least in that room, I think the consensus was this is a several-month endeavor, maybe a few years. But we were still just getting out of the major combat focus and understanding of the world that that there could be a significant insurgency that we were directed to counter. I certainly didn't think it was going to be that much. And I remember on the flight to Tampa, writing out if I had been Al-Qaeda, what I would have done. And I heard various people saying, man, that's just quite a sophisticated attack. And I thought, no, we had 8 or 10 dudes who were able to purchase airline tickets and get on the airlines they had planned to. It's not that it wasn't gutsy, it's not that it wasn't committed, it's not that it didn't have a significant effect, but sophisticated it was not. And we were fortunate because I think they could have done a number of other things.
Right. At some point you find yourself back in Iraqi freedom.
Yeah.
When was that?
So I told you I'd come to DC out of Hawaii, and everybody in the Army typically needs to do some time at the corporate headquarters, and so I was assigned in the Pentagon in the Army G8. So I was lucky enough to be branch chief, and fortunately the other people in the branch knew what we were doing because I didn't really. But we were responsible collectively essentially for the Army's checkbook for equipment in the future years. And so we were having to play with, when do you need that money this year? Because we're clearly deploying forces to Iraq. We're going to use that money that may have been templated for this quarter to do that. We'll get you that money for this future equipment later on in the year. And I remember, I'd been selected for battalion command. I got the call that I had got my first choice, 3rd Battalion of the 187th Infantry. I would get to go back to my regiment. You see right here the unit insignia of the 187th. So my boss didn't get any meaningful work out of me for a week after I heard that. But I was at a computer one day with a colleague, and we were trying to figure out how to fund tank engine repair throughout the Army for the next 15 years. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, somebody here needs to talk to you. I said, look, I don't have time. We got to get this done and over to the right folks and the rest of the staff. Right. And I got another tap and said, you really need to talk to this guy. And I turned around, and it was Major General Dave Petraeus, who was going to take command of the 101st and had commanded the battalion that I was going to go command previously. So I turned around and said, hey, sir, didn't expect to see you here today. And he kind of looked me up and down and thought, But, we talked for a bit, and we both knew that the Army was headed to Kuwait, and that absent something significant changing, there was probably going to be a war. Not long after that, I got a phone call saying General Petraeus was asking the Army to send some of the lieutenant colonels who were going to command battalions later on to deploy them early with the division. And so I was fortunate that I was one of 5 that got to go do that. I knew the G3, the ops officer, Colonel Ricky Gibbs at the time, retired brigadier general, and Ricky assigned me in the rear command post, the sustainment command post, once I got over there, which was a wonderful experience for me. I was essentially the chief of staff of the sustainment command post for the division for a couple of months, working for Brigadier General E.J. Sinclair and the DISCOM commander, Colonel, I can't remember his first name, Rogers, who were terrific individuals. Then a couple weeks before I was supposed to take command of the battalion, I got to move to 3rd Brigade, spent some time in the brigade headquarters, and then with the great Lee Fetterman, who was the guy I was following into command. And I will tell you, that may be the best battalion I've ever been in, and it had little to do with me. First of all, it had the best cadre of senior non-commissioned officers I have ever seen in a unit like that. It also had some really crack company commanders and that handful of senior lieutenants that sort of make the outfit run day to day with the non-commissioned officers. There were terrific majors in the outfit. I was blessed personally that the whole time I was lucky enough to be in command, really top-notch majors. I was sort of the least required guy in the battalion. Sergeant Major Chris Hardy went on to be the Ranger Regiment Sergeant Major, and then the Maneuver Center, the Fort Benning Sergeant Major. Pretty much everybody we touched that showed up there went on to great things, and so it was a fantastic outfit to be a part of.
Right. How had things changed from your first time in Iraq to now, this time? Obviously, your responsibilities and duties had changed, but yeah, overall.
Well, and we were much farther into the country. It was a different fight. I remember when we kicked off the war. Instead of, as we'd done before, this huge leap by brigade into successive positions, now we were moving as part of a corps, slowly moving forward. And the division in particular was utilized to clear towns that 3rd Infantry Division, a mechanized division, had, very soundly tactically bypassed. So that was a different fight. It was a series of fights, essentially by brigade as the division went forward. And once I took command, the division was all the way up north. Our battalion in particular was right along the Syrian border. People have sometimes heard of Tal Afar, Iraq. You go to Mosul, you head out west Talofa is a huge airfield. You go further west, there's a 1 mile high mountain, Sinjar Mountain, that pops up out of nowhere. We were essentially west of that, and our battalion was responsible all the way up into Turkey, a gate between Iraq and Turkey. So it was a huge expanse, and so the dispersion was significantly different. We were lucky enough because if we put a retransmission station up on that huge mountain, we could talk 3 or 4 or 5 times further than our radios were supposed to talk. Right. And so that was certainly advantageous. We ended up with platoons in various posts around the area of operation. While Colonel Fetterman, Lee Fetterman, the guy I had followed, had been focused on fighting the ground war. And this battalion had been attached to 3rd Infantry Division. This battalion had helped secure the Baghdad International Airport. It was a well-trained, capable, it had proven itself, and was awarded, I think, its 6th Presidential Unit Citation as part of 3rd Infantry Division for that. But how dispersed we are was a big change. The mission we had, which we interpreted here, a fairly stable area, is what we wanted to do is turn this into a free market and a democracy. So we weren't there to subjugate anybody, we were there to enable people. And in fact, one of the things I was worried about as a commander was professional loneliness. I thought the first set of people that ought to be professionally lonely were myself, the battalion commander, and the battalion command sergeant major. But you had all these lieutenants off by themselves. So after a while, we brought back some of the platoons back into this huge expanse of the airfield at Talofa. We kept one of our field grade officers, the great Major Colin Fortier, was out in the AO. Major Dave Beachman, our executive officer, and I generally stayed back at Talofa. And this allowed some of the platoons to start regaining some of their physical fitness, do some shooting, get themselves reset so that if we were asked to do something else, we could. Now, I know I'm getting a little past the question here, but I think I think we did the right thing. Our AO was fairly calm. It enabled later on the division to send us to go work for another division. Right. Not without stresses and everything, but by doing that, we freed up some combat power that could later go work with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment down around where the Euphrates goes into Syria in a separate operation.
Was there any thought personally that when you're there in Iraq for the 2nd time that maybe we'd have done it the first time, we wouldn't still be here?
So there weren't many. I think I was the only Desert Storm veteran in the battalion. I think there were a couple others in the brigade. Sergeant Major Hardy had he had earned a CIB in Somalia, a Combat Infantryman's Badge. I believe he and I were the only ones who ended up earning a star on our CIBs in the battalion. So there weren't a lot of people with Desert Storm experience, and so maybe that perspective. I do remember writing home to the families one time and saying, listen, I know you would like your soldiers home. We would love to be home. However, I was here a decade ago. I'm here now. I don't want our kids to have to come another decade from now and have to do something. Now that leads back to your question earlier. Did I think we were going to be there 2 decades, or at least in the Middle East? No. I was arguing that let's invest the time now, and then we won't have to come back in a decade. Well, we were still deployed a decade later.
Yeah. What years were you in Iraq the 2nd time?
So we were there 2003 to 2004.
Okay.
One of the lessons I learned, because I was early to Iraq and late to Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan essentially through 2010. If you're early to a war, there are no rules and there's no infrastructure. Now, I'm being a little facetious there. If you're late to a war, there are all kinds of rules and all kinds of infrastructure. So take your pick.
So you're in Afghanistan now in 2010?
Yeah, I'd finished command of the Old Guard, and I was, for a very short time, there were a few people who didn't go to the War College before Brigade Command. I was part of that crowd. So I was doing a War College fellowship in a think tank in D.C. and not working very hard. And I got a call from Lieutenant General Bill Caldwell, who I had known from when he was a one-star general in Hawaii and I was a major and lieutenant colonel. And actually, I take that back, got an email from him on New Year's Eve. CJ and I were at the commissary getting some goodies for New Year's Eve. And it said, Joe, I need a chief of staff. Do you have any recommendations? And so I went home with CJ. I was thinking about, this guy would be a good fit with General Caldwell, write his name down. This guy, no, he's retired. Who can? And about 90 minutes later or something, CJ said, hey, do you think maybe he's actually asking you? And I thought, oh, well, I mean, sure, that's what I thought at first. And then he called a few hours later and essentially did that. And I told him, I said, sir, that job is actually the one I had asked Human Resources Command to send me to, or excuse me, Senior Leadership Division. And they'd said the timing wouldn't work. I said, but I'm in a fellowship. I can't get out of it. And he said, let me worry about that. And sure enough, a couple days later, I'm CC'd on a note from the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army to the guy that ran this think tank, said, it's okay with you. Joe Buche is getting his stuff and moving out. And one of the funnier things for me about going over to Afghanistan, my boss, again, pretty senior fella, Lieutenant General, one of the senior Lieutenant Generals in the Army, flew to Afghanistan on the back ramp of a C-130, kind of bouncing with everything covered by his poncho liner. I didn't know how I was going to get to Afghanistan, but I knew Command Sergeant Major Ralph Beam was going to be the Sergeant Major there. I sent a note to Sergeant Major Beam, who was in Europe at the time, said, hey, how are you getting there, Sergeant Major? He says, tell you what, you fly to Frankfurt, I'll take care of the rest. Okay. Got a ticket, flew to Frankfurt. Soldier met me at the gate, got me through customs. We drove to Heidelberg. General Ham, Carter Ham, was flying to Kabul the next day, and we were going to get to ride on his personal jet. Well, this is the way to go. So we fly to Berlin first because he's going to have dinner with the U.S. ambassador to Germany. Then we're going to change into our combat outfit and fly to Kabul. We land in Berlin, go to a nice dinner, come back. The pilot says, well, sir, weather here's fine, weather in Kabul's fine, weather in Tbilisi, ain't going to cut it. We can't make it there without refueling. So General Ham says, okay, back to Kaiserslautern, we're going to drive back to Heidelberg tonight. On the flight back, Sergeant Major Beam and I are thinking, well, what do? I mean, do we get a bus to Kabul? How does this work? Well, fortunately, General Ham is working his BlackBerry on the way back, and before we landed, there was a Judge Advocate General opinion that said that Colonel Joe Buche and Command Sergeant Major Ralph Beam can take General Ham's personal jet to Kabul if the following conditions are met. And they had been met. So drove back to Heidelberg, got a good night's sleep, came back the next day, and sat in the nice seats and flew back to Afghanistan. My boss said, well, Joe, how'd you get here? So you're not going to like this. But yeah, I ended up back in Afghanistan. And I want to tell you, I think when the Lord our God first envisioned Army Sergeants Major, he had Ralph Beam's image in his mind. He was a great teammate. It was fantastic to be deployed with him there. And I had known General Caldwell for a while, so we were reestablishing a relationship as opposed to establishing one. It was a significant endeavor. He commanded, General Caldwell commanded Command Security Transition Command Afghanistan and NATO Training Mission Afghanistan simultaneously. So our goal was essentially to train and equip the Afghan security apparatus, national security apparatus. We had advisors in the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Defense. We were responsible to establish the training base for the Army. We helped them figure out how to do budgets each year, what equipment they should have. And that command spent $1 billion a month on the Afghans. So General Gary Patton, and at the time, Colonel John Ferrari, now retired Major General, ran the program shop. And as you can imagine, at the end of that fiscal year, if you're spending $1 billion a month, a lot of things in the Army happen at the end of the FY. And I would go downstairs periodically that day and talk to John and say, hey, everything going okay? And they had laid out which contracts had to happen in which time zones around the world at different times. Right. And he was, no, this one didn't work, so we're going to bump that over here. There were 120 colonels and Navy captains in that command. and I think we had 14 flag officers. So it was certainly top heavy, and so a great deal of capability there, but an interesting endeavor.
Did you ever get a sense that the Afghanis would be able to defend themselves at some point? Were you thinking this is a futile effort, but we're here?
Yeah, so I had been in this think tank in a fellowship in 2009, and you get a little bit of freedom there as an Army officer. You wear civilian clothes, you're calling everybody their first name, you're encouraged to immerse yourself in that environment. And I thought the strategic course of action that made the most sense was to essentially say, we have achieved our strategic objectives in Afghanistan. You know, nobody is going to be able to stage a spectacular attack on the homeland from Afghanistan for a long period of time. Let's begin, you know, withdrawing ourselves. President Obama, you know, went to West Point in late 2009 and essentially said the opposite. We're going to surge. So as an Army officer, my view is, okay, that's the debate is over. We're here to try and carry that out. Now, every congressional delegation that showed up at our headquarters, they saw a slide that showed how much we were spending and how much it was going to cost in the out years. Several $1 billion a year to keep this enterprise going. And that was something we were almost religious zealots about, making sure that our national leaders understand. This is not okay, we're done at the end of 2010, but we're signing up to do this. And the Iraqi GNP, excuse me, the Afghan GNP at that time, I think, was still under $30 billion a year. So we were talking about a quarter-ish of their GNP. Actually, the U.S. was going to have to, or allies, was going to have to underwrite. So I don't know if I thought it was going to work. I do think my job at that time was to do my best and do our best to make it work. And there were some things that we were proud of. You know, you discover things along the way. What you and I would call rampant corruption in some parts of the world is just how it's done. Right. You pay the district police chief the money to pay all the salaries. He takes his salary, skims a little on top, and it happens at every level. That's just how it's done. That's why people want to get promoted. Well, we had noticed that. I mean, a bunch of great people that I worked with noticed that. And so they came up with this idea, okay, we're not going to pay in cash anymore. Everybody, it's the weirdest thing, everybody had a cell phone. Everybody. We're going to pay them by cell phone. We'll send a text that's got a code on their phone. These policemen, privates if you will go to the bank, show them the code, they'll get paid. We're very happy with ourselves. We have figured out how to get around the corruption. Well, we kept getting reports from one area in particular that, hey, the policemen haven't been paid. Policemen haven't been paid. I asked the J8, hey, send to me the person responsible for this. And a major and a non-commissioned officer came and dutifully showed, no, this shows you, here's how they're paid. It did take place. Okay, great. Well, after a few months, it was no, stop. Find 2 people, take 3 if you need it, put them on a helicopter, go there and figure this crap out. Well, what had happened was, again, we'd made these assumptions about what the status was there. And so most of the Afghans are illiterate and, in fact, innumerate. I can figure out a pattern to dial on my phone, push the green button, and my buddy Muhammad or Ahmed answers the phone. Okay, when I'm done, I push the red button. Good. If it makes a noise and wiggles, I push the green button, and who knows who's on the other end. Well, these phones had been wiggling. They'd been opening them up. And push the green button, nobody there, I don't know. Yeah, so the code had been going through, but these guys didn't know what it was. So great effort to convince them of that. Again, we were proud of ourselves. Next thing we know, we find out district police chiefs are forcing their policemen to give them the little SIM card out of their phones and then forcing them to buy back the SIM card so they can go to the bank and get paid. So it's not that easy to wipe out corruption.
Right. Just they'll find a way.
Right. I have a brilliant idea. Believe me, somebody's going to have a more brilliant one.
Yeah. When you take a look back on your career, especially your time in combat, how do you think that's affected or changed your life, changed your perspective?
Yeah. Well, so again, I was fortunate enough to spend 30 years as an infantryman, and I don't know that anybody comes through that sort of in one piece. I've got the ankles and the knees, and to a certain extent the shoulders to prove the wear and tear. I think, like all of us, I don't know if it's PTSD or just you know, how seeing your friends maimed or killed. You know, it's clearly got an effect on everybody. Yeah. I think there's at least for me, there's kind of a stoicism and maybe a calm. It's interesting. A good friend of mine, Tim Fay, the Charlie Company commander in Desert Storm, left the Army and went into what I would characterize as the officer candidate school for United Airlines. And one of the things he had to do was be a customer service rep at an airport. And he told me he was at O'Hare Airport in the middle of the night, and whoever he was with said, "This is as boring as it gets." And he said, "Oh no, this is not as boring as it gets." And so I think those kinds of experiences, both when things are going awry, when there's significant danger or just a great deal of complexity, helps you put things in context. I think, like a lot of people in the Army, I worry about the readiness of our military. We traditionally enter wars unprepared and ill-equipped, and the people that pay the price are generally the 18 to 25-year-olds who are, and the junior NCOs, officers, and soldiers who we commit. It's not that they're bad people or they're not disciplined, but we just haven't invested enough. My undergraduate degree's in economics. I don't know if we can afford to keep that kind of military in place all the time. So that, you know, that kind of wears on you too. But I tell people I was blessed to get to do it, and you know, I really feel that way. I waited to retire. I mean, till the last day I could without actually losing the leave I had accrued to leave the Army, because I really enjoyed it, and I still in my, you know, in present role, I love being in contact with soldiers, trying to stay in touch with them. The previous job I had after I retired fortunately allowed me to still stay in touch. I'm remarkably impressed with the technological innovation surrounding gloves and boots. I started off in the Army with, you know, a wool liner and a leather glove, and probably have some of the numbness to prove it. The boots that I was wearing when I got frostbite in Ranger School were not of any assistance. And, you know, for dismounted infantrymen or infantry persons now, you know, we have sleeping bags and Gore-Tex, and I'm envious of people that get to be equipped that well. Somebody asked me, you know, what's the biggest technological innovation you've seen? I said, well, I don't know about that. I'll tell you the one I appreciate the most: gloves and boots. So I don't know. The last thing I'll say about this is I am concerned when people who have only a distant attachment to service are making decisions about when to commit people to fight, and making decisions about whether the actions they took were prudent. I am absolutely a believer in civilian control of the military. I had an oath to the Constitution. This is a democratic republic. Sometimes those of us who either are in uniform or were in uniform, we're just insufficiently persuasive or explanatory. But there were times in my career where someone from afar had adjudged either my actions or one of my subordinates' actions as ill-conceived. And my response was, well, I can appreciate that from where you are right now and from the perspective you have, you find them ill-conceived. I have, to the best of my ability, really thought through this, and I don't think they were. Given the circumstances, given the requirements, no, I don't think they were. If you don't mind, I'll tell you a story about another great guy I worked for and how this played out. He retired as a 2-star general, Jeff Slugger. He's an aviator, and of course, there's, you know, the infantrymen and aviators. It's one of these, you know, aviator. I was lucky enough, he was one of the assistant commanders when I was battalion commander, and then I got to work directly for him at the National Counterterrorism Center. Excuse me. And in that job, he never said it, but one of the things I learned from his comportment and his behavior was he held his superiors to a higher standard than he did his subordinates. And that meant he held them accountable as a subordinate. He expected great things, sophisticated things from his bosses, and when they let him down, he informed them that they had let him down. And I thought that was a tremendous example to set. Later on in his career, he was the division commander of the 101st Airborne Division. There was an unfortunate circumstance that took place. He investigated it. He took the action he deemed appropriate. And so, you know, in legalese, he disposed of the report of misconduct. Later on, he had been nominated to be a 3-star general. He was informed that the Army was relooking the circumstances. And while I'm paraphrasing here, my understanding is he told his superiors, no, I've already done that. You can charge me, or you can do nothing. And I think he was told essentially, Jeff, you don't understand. And he said, you're right, I don't. You'll have my retirement paperwork. There was a Marine aviator I was with in the Command and Staff College, and at one point in time, he said to the, mostly soldiers in the class, you guys are something, you'll sacrifice your lives for a cause. You just won't sacrifice your careers. And, my take is that battlefield courage is not in short supply. Conference room courage is, unfortunately. And there have been several times I have not been conference room courageous. But here's Jeff Slugger, who was.
It's interesting. Well, that's your last question. What message would you like to convey to someone who might watch this many years in the future?
So I think service in the Army, in my case, is an honorable endeavor. It is not for everybody. I am concerned that we have a problem in our country with veteran homelessness, joblessness, suicide. And if we don't commit the resources, if we don't invest what's needed in order to address those things, the confidence that we have had in our all-volunteer force will be misplaced, because I think we would be in danger then of losing it. Clearly, service in the military, particularly in wartime, is a dangerous endeavor. I am fortunate that, again, I'm fairly whole. I know I have friends and colleagues. That's not the case. But I still think it's worth it. I still think a democratic republic only survives if people are willing to serve and sacrifice. So hopefully, hopefully there's an example that my teammates and I have set that says that, and people are willing to do it, and that would be my enduring message. Service and sacrifice is required for a democratic republic like ours.
Right. Well, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, I thank you for sitting down and talking to us. Very fascinating story, and thank you for your service.
Yeah, and you too.
Thank you.